Imagine standing in the shadowed corridors of the Alcazar of Madrid on a sweltering summer morning in 1665. The air is heavy, thick with the cloying scent of incense and the sharp, metallic tang of blood-soaked linens. Beyond the massive oak doors, the anguished cries of a woman in childbirth pierce the oppressive silence. This is no ordinary birth, it is the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of calculated genetic catastrophe, a moment when the Habsburg dynasty's relentless pursuit of bloodline purity manifests in flesh and bone. The woman in labor is Queen Mariana of Austria, both niece and wife to King Philip IV of Spain. The man pacing the polished marble floors outside is not only her husband and king, but also her uncle, 30 years her senior. The child struggling to enter the world is Charles II, whose very existence will embody the horrifying consequences of royal inbreeding taken to its grotesque extreme. The palace hums with tension, its stone walls seeming to pulse with dread. Courtiers glide silently in silk slippers, their whispers barely audible, their faces taut with anxiety. They know, as does every soul in the Alcazar, that the Spanish Habsburg line teeters on the brink of extinction. Previous heirs, Philip Prospero and Maria Teresa, succumbed to frail bodies unable to sustain life. Now, as Mariana's screams echo through the halls, the fate of an empire hangs in the balance. The true horror lies not in this moment, but in the deliberate choices spanning generations that led here. Each marriage, each alliance sealed with familial blood, each decision to wed cousin to cousin or uncle to niece, was a step toward this inevitable disaster. The Habsburgs did not stumble into genetic ruin, they orchestrated it with the precision of a requiem. To grasp the magnitude of this tragedy, we must journey back to the origins of Habsburg power. The dynasty's rise began in the 13th century, when they emerged as a prominent force in Europe, securing influence through strategic alliances and military prowess. However, their true genetic experiment took shape under Emperor Maximilian I in the late 15th century. Maximilian embraced a motto that would define the family's strategy: Bella gerent ali, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. For the Habsburgs, marriage was not about love or even mere political alliance in the traditional sense. It was a calculated tool to amass power through bloodlines, ensuring that wealth, territories, and influence remained tightly confined within the family circle. This approach initially proved brilliant. Through a series of carefully orchestrated marriages, the Habsburgs gained control over vast territories. By 1519, when Charles V ascended the throne, their empire stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to Naples, encompassing colonies in the New World. The phrase, "the sun never sets," was born to describe this sprawling dominion, a testament to the dynasty's unmatched reach. Yet, even as their political might soared, the seeds of genetic decay were sown. Charles V was himself a product of a first-cousin marriage, his parents, Philip I of Castile and Joanna of Castile, sharing grandparents. This union, while politically advantageous, introduced subtle cracks in the genetic foundation, cracks that would widen with each subsequent generation. The Habsburgs' obsession with bloodline purity stemmed from a desire to consolidate power and prevent rival dynasties from claiming their territories. Marrying within the family ensured that inheritances remained undivided and alliances were forged without diluting the Habsburg name. However, this strategy carried a hidden cost. Each intermarriage increased the likelihood of inheriting harmful recessive genes, a risk the Habsburgs either ignored or failed to understand. The consequences were not immediate, but they were inevitable. By the time Charles V abdicated in 1556, dividing his empire between his son, Philip II, who ruled Spain, and his brother, Ferdinand I, who governed Austria, the stage was set for a genetic tragedy that would unfold over the next century. This division of the empire created 2 interwoven Habsburg lines, Spanish and Austrian, that would intermarry with devastating consequences. The Spanish line, under Philip II, became the epicenter of the dynasty's genetic decline. Philip II, a devout Catholic and a shrewd politician, understood that maintaining Habsburg dominance required keeping power within the family. His 4 marriages reflect this commitment. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin, a union that produced a son, Don Carlos, whose mental instability foreshadowed the troubles to come. After Maria's death in childbirth, Philip married Mary Fern of England, a political alliance that briefly made him king consort of England. Following Mary's death, he wed Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, in a rare departure from the family tradition of marrying close relatives. However, his fourth marriage in 1570, at age 43, to his 20-year-old niece, Anna of Austria, set a perilous precedent. Anna, the daughter of Philip's brother-in-law, Emperor Maximilian II, was both his niece and first cousin once removed. Their son, Philip III, born in 1578, carried forward a genetic burden that grew heavier with each generation. The mathematics of inbreeding are as precise as they are chilling. When close relatives reproduce, the inbreeding coefficient, the likelihood of inheriting identical copies of harmful recessive genes, rises exponentially. In typical human populations, this coefficient is near zero, ensuring genetic diversity and resilience. First cousin marriages yield a coefficient of 0.0625, meaning a 6.25% chance of inheriting harmful genes. The Habsburgs, however, did not stop at one generation of inbreeding. Their systematic intermarriages across multiple generations amplified the risks, creating a genetic time bomb. Philip III, born of an uncle-niece union, entered the world with an already elevated inbreeding coefficient. His marriage in 1599 to Margaret of Austria, his first cousin and sister-in-law's sister, compounded the genetic gamble. Their son, Philip IV, born in 1605, bore an inbreeding coefficient that would have alarmed any modern geneticist. The visible marker of this decline was the Habsburg lip, a protruding lower jaw known as mandibular prognathism that grew more pronounced with each generation, a physical testament to the dynasty's genetic deterioration. Philip IV's reign from 1621 to 1665 coincided with Spain's gradual decline from its imperial zenith. His jaw, a pronounced Habsburg trait, made eating and speaking difficult, and subtle signs of cognitive decline hinted at deeper issues. Political and economic missteps played a role in Spain's weakening, but Philip's personal struggles, seizures, chronic fatigue, and impaired communication undermined his ability to govern effectively. His court became a theater of whispers, where advisors compensated for his limitations while maintaining the facade of royal competence. The Spanish Empire, once the terror of Europe, began to falter as military defeats mounted and colonial revenues dwindled. Yet, Philip IV's most fateful decision was his marriage in 1649 at age 44 to his 15-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. This union, driven by the Habsburg obsession with bloodline purity, would produce Charles II and seal the dynasty's fate. Mariana, the daughter of Philip's sister, Maria Anna, and Emperor Ferdinand III, was related to him through multiple lines of descent. Originally betrothed to Philip's son, Balthazar Charles, she was reassigned to Philip after Balthazar's death in 1646. The 29-year age gap was irrelevant to the Habsburgs. What mattered was keeping the bloodline pure. Mariana, frail and nervous, struggled with the weight of queenship. Raised in the Austrian court with the expectation of a familial marriage, she was unprepared for the reality of being wed to her uncle. Court records describe her frequent illnesses, difficulty with public speaking, and bouts of melancholy, traits that would echo in her son. The union produced several children, but most died young. Maria Theresa, born in 1638 from Philip's first marriage, survived to marry Louis XIV of France. Philip Prospero, born in 1657 to Mariana, was a frail heir whose short life foreshadowed the horrors to come. He struggled to walk, suffered seizures, and died in 1661 at age 4. The pressure on Mariana to produce another heir was immense, as the Spanish Empire desperately needed a strong ruler to navigate its mounting crises. On November 6, 1665, Charles II was born after a grueling labor that nearly killed both mother and child. The attending physicians and midwives were horrified by the infant's appearance: a disproportionately large head, underdeveloped limbs, and grotesquely distorted facial features. The Habsburg lip reached its apex in Charles II, rendering his lower jaw so protruding that his teeth couldn't meet, making chewing impossible. His mental development lagged severely. He didn't speak until age 4, and his speech was barely intelligible. He couldn't walk unaided until age 8, and his motor skills remained compromised throughout his life. The court physicians, limited by 17th century medicine, attributed his condition to supernatural causes, curses, divine punishment, or evil spirits. Modern genetics reveals the truth. Charles II's inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than that of a child born to siblings, meant he inherited identical copies of recessive genes at an unprecedented rate. He suffered from mandibular prognathism, mental retardation, epilepsy, and metabolic disorders, his body a living testament to 2 centuries of genetic mismanagement. The Spanish court labored to conceal Charles II's condition. Official portraits were manipulated to downplay his deformities, and ceremonies were choreographed to mask his limitations. Yet, whispers spread across Europe about the Mad King of Spain. Charles II's birth marked not just the arrival of a frail heir, but the beginning of the end for the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty that had gambled its future on the purity of its bloodline and lost. The tragedy of Charles II, born in the shadowed halls of the Alcazar of Madrid in 1665, cannot be fully understood without tracing the ascent of the Habsburg dynasty and the perilous path they charted through their marriage practices. The Habsburg story begins in the 13th century when they emerged as a formidable force in Europe, leveraging strategic alliances and military conquests to secure their influence. However, their true ascent to power and the seeds of their eventual downfall took root in the late 15th century under Emperor Maximilian I, a visionary ruler who understood the power of dynastic unions. Maximilian I embraced a motto that would become the cornerstone of Habsburg strategy: Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This principle transformed marriage into a tool of empire building, far removed from notions of love or even traditional political alliances. For the Habsburgs, marriage was a calculated means to consolidate power, amass territories, and ensure that wealth and influence remained within the family. By forging unions with other royal houses, often within their own bloodline, they sought to create an unbreakable chain of loyalty and inheritance, binding their vast domains together through shared ancestry. This strategy proved remarkably effective in the short term. Through a series of meticulously planned marriages, the Habsburgs expanded their reach across Europe. By 1519, when Charles V ascended the throne, their empire was a colossus, stretching from the sunlit shores of Spain to the forested hills of Austria, from the bustling ports of the Netherlands to the vibrant cities of Naples. Their dominions extended even to the New World, where Spanish colonies fueled the empire with gold and silver. The phrase, "the sun never sets," was coined to describe this unparalleled expanse, a testament to the Habsburgs' ability to weave a complex web of alliances through marriage. Charles V, crowned Holy Roman Emperor, ruled over a domain that seemed invincible, a patchwork of territories united by the Habsburg name. Yet, beneath this glittering facade, the genetic foundation of the dynasty was already weakening. Charles V himself was a product of a first-cousin marriage, his parents, Philip I of Castile and Joanna of Castile, sharing grandparents. This union, while politically advantageous, introduced the first subtle signs of genetic vulnerability. Charles V suffered from a pronounced jaw, a condition later known as mandibular prognathism or the Habsburg lip, which made eating and speaking challenging. Though not yet debilitating, this trait hinted at the recessive genes accumulating within the family's bloodline. The Habsburgs, driven by their obsession with bloodline purity, either failed to recognize or chose to ignore the risks of their intermarriages. Their focus was on power, not posterity, and the consequences of their choices would not become fully apparent for generations. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, he divided his sprawling empire between his son, Philip II, who inherited Spain and its vast colonial holdings, and his brother, Ferdinand I, who took control of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. This division created 2 distinct but intertwined Habsburg lines, Spanish and Austrian, that would continue to intermarry, amplifying the genetic risks with each union. The Spanish line, under Philip II, became the epicenter of the dynasty's genetic decline as their marriage practices grew increasingly insular. Philip II, a devout Catholic and a master of political strategy, understood that maintaining Habsburg dominance required keeping power within the family. His reign from 1556 to 1598 marked a turning point in the dynasty's genetic trajectory, as he embraced the family tradition of marrying close relatives with unwavering commitment. Philip II's 4 marriages reflect the Habsburg obsession with familial unions. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his first cousin, sharing the same grandparents. Their union produced a son, Don Carlos, whose mental instability and erratic behavior foreshadowed the genetic troubles that would plague future generations. Maria died in childbirth, a common fate in an era of limited medical knowledge, but her death did not deter Philip from continuing the family's inbreeding practices. His second marriage to Mary Thorey of England was a political alliance that briefly made him king consort of England, though it produced no heirs. After Mary's death, Philip married Elizabeth of Valois, a French princess, in a rare departure from the Habsburg tradition of marrying within the family. This union, driven by diplomatic necessity, was an exception rather than the rule. Philip's fourth and final marriage in 1570 set a dangerous precedent for the dynasty's future. At age 43, he wed his 20-year-old niece, Anna of Austria, the daughter of his brother-in-law, Emperor Maximilian II. Anna was not only his niece, but also his first cousin once removed, a union that further entangled the Habsburg family tree. The marriage of Philip II and Anna of Austria produced Philip III, born in 1578, who carried forward an increasingly heavy genetic burden. The mathematics of inbreeding are stark and unforgiving. When close relatives reproduce, the inbreeding coefficient, the likelihood of inheriting identical copies of harmful recessive genes, increases exponentially. In typical human populations, this coefficient hovers near 0, ensuring genetic diversity and resilience. First cousin marriages, like that of Philip II's parents, yield a coefficient of 0.0625, meaning a 6.25% chance of inheriting harmful genes. Uncle-niece unions, like that of Philip II and Anna, push this coefficient even higher, doubling the risk for their offspring. The Habsburgs, however, did not stop at single-generation inbreeding. Their systematic intermarriages across multiple generations created a compounding effect, where each union increased the likelihood of genetic disorders. Philip III, born of this uncle-niece union, inherited an inbreeding coefficient that was already elevated beyond safe levels. His marriage in 1599 to Margaret of Austria, his first cousin and sister-in-law's sister, further amplified the genetic risks. Margaret was related to Philip III through multiple lines of descent, making their relationship a complex web of shared ancestry. Their son, Philip IV, born in 1605, entered the world with an inbreeding coefficient that would have been alarming to any modern geneticist. The physical manifestation of this genetic decline was the Habsburg lip, which became more pronounced in Philip IV. His lower jaw protruded noticeably, making eating and speaking difficult, and subtle signs of cognitive decline hinted at deeper issues. Contemporary portraits of Philip IV reveal a man whose regal bearing could not fully mask the physical toll of his ancestry. His jaw, a hallmark of the Habsburg line, was a visible reminder of the dynasty's genetic gamble. Philip IV's reign from 1621 to 1665 marked the beginning of Spain's decline from its imperial zenith. Political and economic challenges such as costly wars, mismanaged finances, and competition from rising powers like France and England contributed to this decline. However, Philip IV's personal struggles cannot be overlooked. His recurring health problems, including seizures and chronic fatigue, impaired his ability to govern effectively. His difficulty speaking clearly, a result of his pronounced jaw, hindered communication with advisors and foreign dignitaries, weakening his authority at critical moments. The Spanish court became a place of intrigue and improvisation as advisors and nobles worked to maintain the illusion of a strong monarchy while compensating for the king's limitations. The Habsburg lip, or mandibular prognathism, was more than a cosmetic flaw. It was a visible marker of the dynasty's genetic deterioration. Caused by recessive genes that control jaw development, this trait became increasingly severe with each generation of inbreeding. In normal populations, such recessive genes are masked by dominant alleles, ensuring balanced development. In highly inbred families like the Habsburgs, however, the recessive traits express themselves with growing frequency and severity. Early Habsburg rulers, like Maximilian I, showed mild signs of the protruding jaw. By Charles V, the deformity was clearly visible, though not yet debilitating. Philip II's portraits reveal a more pronounced version, and Philip III's jaw projected noticeably forward. In Philip IV, the trait reached a new level of severity, foreshadowing the catastrophic expression it would find in his son, Charles II. The Habsburgs' commitment to inbreeding was not driven by ignorance alone. It was a deliberate choice, rooted in the belief that bloodline purity would safeguard their power. Each marriage was a political act designed to reinforce alliances and prevent rival dynasties from claiming Habsburg territories. Yet this strategy carried a hidden cost, one that would become fully apparent only in the next generation. Philip IV's decision to marry his niece, Mariana of Austria, in 1649, would push the dynasty to the brink of genetic collapse, setting the stage for the birth of Charles II and the tragic culmination of the Habsburg experiment. The tragedy of Charles II, born in 1665, was not an isolated event, but the inevitable result of a dynasty that had long prioritized bloodline purity over human health. To understand the depth of this catastrophe, we must examine the reign of Philip IV, Charles II's father, whose decisions cemented the Habsburgs' path to genetic ruin. Philip IV's rule, from 1621 to 1665, marked the beginning of Spain's decline from its imperial zenith, a decline exacerbated by both political missteps and the king's personal struggles with the physical and mental toll of inbreeding. Philip IV ascended the throne at the age of 16, inheriting an empire that was still vast but increasingly strained. Spain's dominance, built on the wealth of its New World colonies and the military might of its armies, was beginning to falter. The 30 Years' War, costly conflicts with France and the Netherlands, and internal economic mismanagement drained the empire's resources. The once formidable Spanish Armada faced challenges from rising naval powers like England and the Dutch Republic. Yet while these external pressures were significant, Philip IV's personal limitations played a critical role in Spain's weakening position. Born in 1605 to Philip III and Margaret of Austria, Philip IV was the product of a union between first cousins who were also related through multiple lines of descent. His inbreeding coefficient was alarmingly high, and its effects were visible in his pronounced Habsburg lip, a protruding lower jaw that made eating and speaking difficult. This condition, known as mandibular prognathism, was not merely cosmetic. It hindered his ability to communicate effectively with advisors and foreign dignitaries, a critical flaw for a king navigating a complex political landscape. Contemporary accounts describe Philip IV as a man of refined tastes and intellectual curiosity, with a deep appreciation for art and theater. He was a patron of painters like Diego Velázquez, whose portraits captured the king's regal bearing while subtly hinting at his physical deformities. However, these accounts also note his recurring health problems, including seizures, chronic fatigue, and periods of melancholy, which impaired his decision-making at crucial moments. His difficulty speaking clearly, a direct result of his jaw deformity, forced him to rely heavily on advisors, some of whom exploited his weaknesses to advance their own agendas. The Spanish court became a labyrinth of intrigue, where nobles and ministers maneuvered to maintain the illusion of a strong monarchy while compensating for the king's limitations. The Habsburg lip, a hallmark of the family's genetic decline, was more than a physical trait. It was a symbol of the dynasty's growing fragility. Caused by recessive genes governing jaw development, the deformity became more severe with each generation of inbreeding. In Philip IV, it was pronounced enough to affect his daily life, from eating meals to delivering speeches. Portraits from his reign show a man whose dignity could not fully mask the toll of his ancestry. His jaw projected noticeably forward, and his health issues, seizures, digestive problems, and fatigue, suggested deeper genetic issues that would manifest more fully in his son, Charles II. The court physicians, limited by the medical knowledge of the 17th century, could offer little beyond superstitious remedies or prayers, attributing his ailments to divine will or environmental factors rather than the true cause: centuries of intermarriage. Philip IV's most consequential decision, and the one that would seal the Habsburgs' genetic fate, was his marriage in 1649 to his 15-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria. Born in 1634, Mariana was the daughter of Philip's sister, Maria Anna, and Emperor Ferdinand III of Austria, making her not only his niece but also his first cousin, once removed and related through multiple other lines of descent. This union was a stark demonstration of the Habsburgs' unwavering commitment to bloodline purity. Mariana had originally been betrothed to Philip's son, Balthazar Charles, the heir to the Spanish throne. However, when Balthazar died unexpectedly in 1646 at the age of 16, the Habsburgs simply reassigned Mariana to Philip himself, despite the 29-year age gap. For the Habsburgs, such considerations were irrelevant. What mattered was keeping the bloodline intact and the inheritance within the family circle. Mariana of Austria was ill-prepared for the burdens of queenship. Raised in the Austrian court with the expectation of a familial marriage, she was a frail and nervous young woman, unaccustomed to the intense scrutiny and political machinations of the Spanish court. Contemporary accounts describe her as delicate, prone to frequent illnesses, and struggling with public speaking. Her letters to family members in Austria reveal a sense of overwhelm as she grappled with the responsibilities of being queen to her own uncle. Her tendency toward melancholy and nervous disposition would later appear in magnified form in her son, Charles II, suggesting that she too carried the genetic burden of the Habsburg bloodline. The marriage of Philip IV and Mariana produced several children, but most succumbed to the frailties inherited from their inbred ancestry. Maria Theresa, born in 1638 from Philip's first marriage to Elizabeth of Valois, survived to adulthood and was married to Louis XIV of France as part of a peace treaty, strengthening ties between the two nations but removing her from the Spanish succession. Philip Prospero, born in 1657 to Mariana, was hailed as the heir to the Spanish throne, but his health was precarious from birth. Court records describe a child who struggled to walk, spoke with difficulty, and suffered from frequent seizures. His immune system was so compromised that common childhood illnesses posed life-threatening risks. Philip Prospero's short life, ending in 1661 at the age of 4, was a grim preview of the genetic horrors that awaited the next generation. His death left the Spanish court in desperate need of an heir, placing immense pressure on Mariana to produce another son. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by military defeats and economic decline, desperately needed a strong ruler to maintain its position in European politics. The loss of Philip Prospero intensified the court's anxiety as the Habsburg line grew ever closer to extinction. The genetic odds were stacked against any child born of Philip IV and Mariana's union. Their inbreeding coefficient was so high that their offspring faced an extreme risk of genetic disorders, physical deformities, and mental disabilities. The court, unaware of the scientific basis for these risks, clung to hope and tradition, believing that divine intervention or sheer willpower could overcome the dynasty's mounting troubles. Philip IV's reign was a paradox of grandeur and decay. The Spanish court remained a center of cultural splendor, with lavish ceremonies, grand palaces, and masterpieces of art and architecture. Yet beneath this opulence, the empire was crumbling. The costs of prolonged wars, such as the ongoing conflict with France and the revolt in the Netherlands, drained the treasury. Colonial revenues, once the lifeblood of the empire, began to decline as trade routes shifted and rival powers like England and the Dutch Republic gained ground. The Spanish military, once the terror of Europe, suffered repeated defeats, its morale sapped by poor leadership and dwindling resources. Philip IV's personal struggles only compounded these challenges, as his health issues and reliance on advisors left the empire vulnerable to internal corruption and external threats. The marriage of Philip IV and Mariana was not just a personal union, but a political act with far-reaching consequences. It represented the Habsburgs' unyielding commitment to their genetic experiment, even as the signs of failure became impossible to ignore. The court's efforts to maintain the illusion of royal strength grew increasingly strained as whispers of the king's frailties spread beyond Spain's borders. Foreign ambassadors noted Philip's difficulty speaking and his frequent illnesses, reporting back to their governments about the weakening grip of the Spanish monarchy. The stage was set for the birth of Charles II, a child who would embody the full extent of the Habsburgs' genetic gamble and bring the dynasty to its tragic end. The pressure on Mariana to produce a healthy heir was immense, but the genetic legacy she and Philip IV shared made this a near impossible task. Their union, like those of their ancestors, was a calculated risk, driven by the belief that bloodline purity would safeguard the Habsburg legacy. Instead, it would produce a king whose very existence would testify to the dangers of inbreeding, a living symbol of a dynasty that had conquered empires but could not conquer its own biology. On November 6, 1665, the Alcazar of Madrid was gripped by a tense anticipation that bordered on dread. Queen Mariana of Austria, niece and wife to King Philip IV, endured a grueling labor that pushed both mother and child to the brink of death. When the infant Charles II finally emerged, the attending physicians and midwives recoiled in horror. His appearance was shocking, even by the standards of a dynasty accustomed to physical anomalies. His head was disproportionately large, his limbs frail and underdeveloped, and his facial features grotesquely distorted. The Habsburg lip, mandibular prognathism, reached its most extreme form in Charles II, with his lower jaw protruding so far that his teeth could not meet, rendering chewing impossible. This birth was not a moment of triumph, but a grim milestone, marking the culmination of nearly 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding and the beginning of the dynasty's final chapter. The Spanish court, already anxious after the deaths of previous heirs, was thrown into a state of silent panic. The loss of Philip Prospero in 1661 at age 4, a frail child plagued by seizures and weakness, had left the empire without a viable successor. Maria Theresa, Philip IV's daughter from his first marriage, had been married off to Louis XIV of France, removing her from the line of succession. Now, with Charles II's birth, the court clung to the hope that this child would secure the Habsburg legacy. Yet the signs were ominous from the start. The infant's physical deformities were unlike anything seen in previous generations, and his cries were weak, signaling a body ill-equipped for survival. Courtiers whispered in hushed tones, their silk slippers gliding across marble floors as they exchanged fearful glances. The air in the Alcazar was thick with incense, meant to ward off evil spirits, but it could not mask the metallic scent of blood or the palpable fear seeping from the walls. Charles II's condition was a direct result of the Habsburgs' relentless pursuit of bloodline purity. The dynasty's marriage practices, designed to consolidate power within the family, had created a genetic disaster. The mathematics of inbreeding are stark and unforgiving. When close relatives reproduce, the inbreeding coefficient, the likelihood of inheriting identical copies of harmful recessive genes, increases exponentially. In typical human populations, this coefficient is near zero, ensuring genetic diversity and resilience. First cousin marriages, common among the Habsburgs, yield a coefficient of 0.0625, meaning a 6.25% chance of inheriting harmful genes. Uncle-niece unions, like that of Philip IV and Mariana, push this coefficient higher, doubling the risk for their offspring. Charles II, born of such a union, had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than that of a child born to siblings. This meant he inherited identical copies of recessive genes at an unprecedented rate, resulting in a litany of genetic disorders. Modern genetic analysis reveals the extent of Charles II's afflictions: mandibular prognathism, mental retardation, epilepsy, and various metabolic disorders. His lower jaw was so deformed that he could not chew solid food, relying instead on broths and porridges that he struggled to swallow. His mental development was severely delayed. He did not speak his first words until age 4, and even then, his speech was barely intelligible due to his jaw deformity and cognitive impairments. He could not walk without assistance until age 8, and his motor skills remained compromised throughout his life. His immune system was so weakened that common illnesses posed life-threatening risks, and frequent seizures further ravaged his fragile body. These conditions were not random misfortunes, but the inevitable result of centuries of intermarriage, where harmful recessive genes, once masked by genetic diversity, were expressed with devastating clarity. The court physicians, limited by the medical knowledge of the 17th century, were at a loss to explain Charles II's condition. Lacking any understanding of genetics, they turned to superstitious explanations, attributing his ailments to divine punishment, political curses, or evil spirits. Some blame Mariana's diet during pregnancy, suggesting that her consumption of certain foods had corrupted the child. Others whispered of supernatural forces, claiming that the Habsburg sins had invoked God's wrath. The most common explanation was that the royal family was being punished for its hubris, a belief reinforced by the deeply religious culture of the Spanish court. Priests and exorcists were summoned to pray over the infant, their chants mingling with the incense that filled the air. These rituals offered no relief, but they underscored the desperation of a court grappling with a crisis it could neither understand nor control. Queen Mariana, only 31 at the time of Charles II's birth, was overwhelmed by the responsibility of producing a healthy heir. Her own health, already fragile, was further strained by the difficult labor and the emotional toll of seeing her son's condition. Court records describe her as a nervous and melancholy figure, prone to frequent illnesses and struggling to fulfill her role as queen. Her letters to family in Austria reveal a woman torn between hope and despair, clinging to the belief that her son might overcome his frailties while fearing the worst. The pressure on Mariana was immense, as the Spanish Empire, already weakened by military defeats and economic decline, desperately needed a strong ruler to maintain its position in European politics. The court's hopes rested on Charles II, but his condition made it clear that he would never be the leader Spain needed. The Spanish court went to great lengths to conceal Charles II's deformities. Official portraits were carefully composed to minimize his physical abnormalities, with artists instructed to soften the appearance of his jaw and exaggerate his regal bearing. Court ceremonies were choreographed to hide his limitations, with attendants guiding his movements and ensuring he appeared only briefly in public. Foreign ambassadors were coached on how to interact with the young prince in ways that would not embarrass the royal family or reveal the extent of his disabilities. Yet whispers spread beyond Spain's borders, carried by diplomats who reported back to their governments about the frail heir to the Spanish throne. These reports fueled speculation about the future of the Habsburg dynasty and the stability of the Spanish Empire, which was increasingly seen as a fading power. The birth of Charles II was a turning point for the Habsburgs, a moment when the consequences of their genetic experiment became undeniable. The dynasty that had once ruled half the world was now represented by a child whose very existence testified to the dangers of inbreeding. The court's efforts to maintain the illusion of royal strength were a desperate attempt to preserve the Habsburg legacy, but the truth could not be hidden forever. Charles II's life would be a testament to the dynasty's hubris, a living symbol of a family that had gambled its future on the purity of its bloodline and lost. The broader implications of Charles II's condition were not immediately apparent to the Spanish court, but they would soon reverberate across Europe. The Habsburgs' obsession with bloodline purity had not only produced a frail heir, but also set the stage for a geopolitical crisis. The Spanish Empire, already strained by internal and external pressures, faced an uncertain future as rival powers, France, England, and the Austrian Habsburgs, began to position themselves for the inevitable collapse of the Spanish line. The birth of Charles II was not just a personal tragedy for Mariana and Philip IV, but a harbinger of the dynasty's end, a moment when the weight of 2 centuries of calculated marriages came crashing down in the form of a broken child. The birth of Charles II on November 6, 1665, marked a grim milestone for the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty teetering on the edge of extinction. From his first breath, Charles was a living testament to the catastrophic consequences of 2 centuries of inbreeding. His frail body and distorted features, a stark warning of the genetic price paid for bloodline purity. The Spanish court, desperate to preserve the illusion of a strong monarchy, embarked on an elaborate charade to conceal the young prince's condition, even as his physical and mental limitations became increasingly apparent. His early life was a struggle against a body that betrayed him at every turn, set against the backdrop of a declining empire and a court gripped by fear and denial. Charles II's physical deformities were evident from the moment of his birth. His disproportionately large head, underdeveloped limbs, and severely distorted facial features shocked the attending physicians and midwives. The Habsburg lip, mandibular prognathism, reached its apex in Charles, with his lower jaw protruding so far that his teeth could not meet, making chewing impossible. His condition was compounded by a litany of genetic disorders, mental retardation, epilepsy, and metabolic issues that left him vulnerable to frequent infections. He did not speak his first words until age 4, and even then, his speech was barely intelligible. garbled by his jaw deformity and cognitive impairments. Walking was an even greater challenge. He could not move without assistance until age 8, and his motor skills remained severely compromised. His immune system, weakened by his genetic makeup, struggled to fend off even minor illnesses, which often left him bedridden for weeks. The Spanish court, steeped in tradition and religious fervor, was ill-equipped to understand the scientific basis of Charles's condition. Lacking knowledge of genetics, court physicians attributed his ailments to supernatural causes, divine punishment, curses, or malevolent spirits. Some suggested that Queen Mariana's diet during pregnancy had caused the child's deformities, while others whispered that the Habsburg sins had invoked God's wrath. Priests were summoned to perform exorcisms and blessings over the infant, their chants echoing through the incense-filled halls of the Alcazar. These rituals, though fervent, were futile, offering no relief for a condition rooted in the dynasty's tangled family tree. Modern genetic analysis reveals that Charles II's inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, higher than that of a child born to siblings, resulted in an unprecedented accumulation of harmful recessive genes. Every mutation carried by his ancestors was expressed in his tortured body, a biological catastrophe centuries in the making. Queen Mariana, only 31 at the time of Charles's birth, was overwhelmed by the challenges of raising such a frail child. Her own health, already fragile from a difficult labor and the stresses of queenship, deteriorated further as she grappled with her son's condition. Court records describe her as a nervous and melancholic figure, prone to frequent illnesses and bouts of despair. Her letters to family in Austria reveal a mother torn between hope and resignation, desperately seeking cures for her son while fearing he would never fulfill his role as heir. Mariana consulted physicians, priests, and even folk healers, hoping for a miracle to alleviate Charles's suffering. Her protective instincts grew stronger as he aged, shielding him from the harsh realities of his condition, while pushing him to meet the expectations of royalty, a nearly impossible task given his limitations. The court's efforts to conceal Charles II's condition were both elaborate and desperate. Official portraits were carefully crafted to downplay his deformities, with artists instructed to soften the appearance of his jaw and emphasize his regal attire. Ceremonies were choreographed to minimize his public appearances, with attendants guiding his movements to mask his physical weaknesses. When Charles was presented to the court or foreign dignitaries, these events were brief and tightly controlled, ensuring that his inability to speak clearly or move independently went unnoticed. Foreign ambassadors, however, were not easily deceived. Their reports back to their governments described a frail and sickly prince, raising doubts about the future of the Spanish monarchy. Whispers of the Mad Prince began to circulate across European courts, fueling speculation about Spain's stability and the viability of the Habsburg line. Charles II's early years were marked by constant medical interventions, most of which were ineffective or even harmful. Physicians prescribed a range of treatments from herbal remedies to bloodletting in a futile attempt to strengthen his fragile body. His diet was restricted to broths, porridges, and other soft foods that he could swallow without chewing, but even these caused difficulties due to his jaw deformity. He remained painfully thin, his body unable to extract adequate nutrition, which further weakened his already compromised immune system. Frequent seizures, a hallmark of his epilepsy, left him exhausted and disoriented, sometimes lasting for hours and requiring constant supervision. These episodes were particularly distressing for the court as Charles's distorted features became even more pronounced during convulsions, a grim reminder of the dynasty's genetic decline. The psychological toll on Charles was profound, even in his early years. Trapped in a body that limited his every action, surrounded by courtiers who treated him with a mix of pity and deference, he began to develop signs of paranoia and mistrust. He was acutely aware, even as a child, that he was different, a fact reinforced by the hushed conversations and averted gazes of those around him. His inability to engage in normal childhood activities, running, playing, or even speaking clearly, isolated him from his peers, leaving him dependent on a small circle of trusted servants and his mother. Mariana's protective nature, while well-intentioned, further isolated Charles, creating a bubble around him that shielded him from reality but also deepened his sense of alienation. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by economic decline and military setbacks, faced mounting challenges during Charles II's early years. The loss of territories in the Netherlands and defeats in the 30 Years' War had eroded Spain's dominance, while internal corruption and mismanagement drained the treasury. The court's focus on concealing Charles's condition diverted attention from these pressing issues, as advisors and nobles worked to maintain the facade of a strong monarchy. The Spanish Inquisition, a powerful force in the deeply religious society, gained influence during this period, capitalizing on the court's obsession with divine explanations for the prince's ailments. Religious ceremonies became a central feature of court life, with masses and prayers offered daily for Charles's health and the preservation of the Habsburg dynasty. The broader implications of Charles II's condition were beginning to ripple across Europe. Foreign powers, particularly France and the Austrian Habsburgs, closely monitored the situation in Spain, aware that the frail prince was unlikely to produce an heir. The question of the Spanish succession loomed large as rival dynasties positioned themselves to claim the throne in the event of Charles's death. Diplomatic negotiations became exercises in speculation, with ambassadors reporting on every cough or seizure as a potential harbinger of Spain's collapse. The Spanish court, caught between loyalty to the monarchy and the reality of Charles's unfitness, developed elaborate systems to govern around him, with councils and ministers making decisions in his name. Charles II's early life was a microcosm of the Habsburgs' decline, a period defined by denial, desperation, and the slow unraveling of an empire. The court's efforts to present him as a viable heir were a testament to their commitment to the Habsburg legacy, but they could not hide the truth. The young prince, whose every breath was a struggle, embodied the consequences of a dynasty that had prioritized bloodline purity over human health. His condition was not just a personal tragedy, but a warning of the genetic catastrophe that awaited the Habsburgs, a catastrophe that would soon engulf Spain and reshape the balance of power in Europe. As Charles II transitioned from childhood to adolescence in the 1670s, the Spanish court faced an increasingly impossible task: maintaining the illusion of a capable heir while grappling with the undeniable reality of his severe disabilities. Born in 1665 as the product of 2 centuries of Habsburg inbreeding, Charles was a living embodiment of the dynasty's genetic decline. His adolescence was marked by physical frailty, mental limitations, and a deepening sense of isolation set against the backdrop of a Spanish empire sliding further into decline. The court's efforts to conceal his condition grew ever more elaborate, but the whispers of the Mad King spread across Europe, fueling political intrigue and foreshadowing the dynasty's collapse. Charles II's physical and mental condition showed no improvement as he grew older. His mandibular prognathism, the Habsburg lip, was so severe that his lower jaw protruded far beyond his upper, making chewing impossible and speech nearly unintelligible. He relied on a diet of broths, porridges, and other soft foods, but even these caused difficulties, as his jaw deformity complicated swallowing. His body remained painfully thin, unable to extract sufficient nutrition, and his immune system was so compromised that minor infections often escalated into life-threatening crises. Frequent seizures, a hallmark of his epilepsy, plagued him, sometimes occurring multiple times a day and leaving him exhausted or unconscious for hours. His motor skills, already limited, made walking a laborious task, requiring constant assistance from attendants. By his early teens, Charles's appearance was shocking even to those accustomed to the Habsburgs' distinctive features, his distorted face and frail frame a stark contrast to the regal image the court sought to project. Mentally, Charles II lagged far behind his peers. His speech, when it emerged at age 4, remained garbled and difficult to understand, a result of both his physical deformities and cognitive impairments. He struggled to grasp complex ideas, and his education, carefully tailored to his limitations, was rudimentary at best. Court tutors, aware of his challenges, focused on basic literacy and religious instruction, but Charles showed little aptitude for either. His behavior was erratic, marked by periods of apathy punctuated by sudden outbursts of frustration or paranoia. Trapped in a body that betrayed him and surrounded by courtiers who treated him with a mix of pity and deference, Charles developed a deep mistrust of those around him. He became convinced that he was under constant threat from poisoners or assassins, a paranoia fueled by his isolation and the court's own secretive atmosphere. The Spanish court went to extraordinary lengths to conceal Charles II's condition. aware that the stability of the empire depended on the perception of a strong monarchy. Official portraits were masterpieces of deception, with artists instructed to minimize his deformities and emphasize his royal attire. The Habsburg lip was softened, his frail frame draped in opulent robes to suggest vigor. Public appearances were rare and meticulously choreographed, with attendants guiding his movements and ensuring he spoke as little as possible. When Charles was presented to foreign dignitaries, these encounters were brief, with courtiers filling the silence with flattery or distraction. The court's religious fervor, amplified by the Spanish Inquisition, played a central role in this charade. Priests and bishops were ever present, offering prayers and blessings to protect the young king, reinforcing the narrative that his ailments were a divine test rather than a genetic catastrophe. Queen Mariana, Charles's mother, was both his fiercest protector and a source of his isolation. Her own health, weakened by years of stress and illness, deteriorated further as she watched her son struggle. Her letters to family in Austria reveal a woman consumed by guilt and despair, torn between her love for Charles and the knowledge that he could never fulfill his role as king. She consulted a parade of physicians, priests, and folk healers, seeking any remedy that might alleviate his suffering. These efforts were in vain, as 17th-century medicine offered no solutions for conditions rooted in genetics. Mariana's protective instincts led her to shield Charles from the court's political machinations, but this only deepened his dependence on her and a small circle of trusted servants. The young king, unable to navigate the complexities of court life, became a figurehead, his presence a symbol of continuity rather than power. The Spanish Empire's decline accelerated during Charles II's adolescence. The economic toll of prolonged wars, mismanaged colonial revenues, and internal corruption left the treasury depleted. The Spanish military, once the terror of Europe, suffered humiliating defeats against France and the Dutch Republic, its morale eroded by poor leadership and dwindling resources. The court's focus on concealing Charles's condition diverted attention from these crises, as advisors and nobles grappled with governing an empire without a capable ruler. The Spanish Inquisition, seizing on the court's religious obsession, gained even greater influence, promoting the idea that Spain's troubles and Charles's ailments were divine punishment for moral failings. This narrative, while comforting to some, only deepened the sense of despair that permeated the court. Foreign powers, particularly France and the Austrian Habsburgs, closely monitored Charles II's health, aware that his survival was precarious and his ability to produce an heir doubtful. Diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals a Europe increasingly preoccupied with the question of the Spanish succession. Ambassadors stationed in Madrid reported on every seizure, every illness, and every public appearance, analyzing the young king's condition for signs of imminent collapse. France, under Louis XIV, had a strong claim to the Spanish throne through Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister, while the Austrian Habsburgs argued that the Spanish territories should revert to their branch of the family. Other powers, including England and the Dutch Republic, formed alliances to counterbalance French or Austrian ambitions, setting the stage for the War of the Spanish Succession. Charles II's psychological state deteriorated as he entered his teens. His paranoia grew more pronounced, fueled by the court's secretive atmosphere and his own awareness of his limitations. He was not oblivious to his role as the last hope of the Habsburg line, a burden that weighed heavily on his fragile mind. He developed elaborate rituals around food and daily activities, refusing to eat anything that had not been tested by trusted servants. His fear of poisoning led to complex food-tasting ceremonies, with courtiers sampling every dish before it reached his lips. These rituals, born of paranoia, became a daily ordeal, further isolating him from the court. His dependence on Mariana and a handful of loyal attendants made him vulnerable to manipulation, as factions within the court vied for influence over the young king. The cultural and intellectual life of Spain during Charles II's adolescence reflected the empire's decay. The once vibrant Spanish Golden Age, marked by the works of Cervantes and Velázquez, gave way to a darker, more introspective tone. Paintings from this period often carry a surreal, almost nightmarish quality, capturing the psychological tension of a kingdom ruled by a frail and incapacitated heir. Literature explored themes of madness, divine judgment, and decay with thinly veiled references to the royal family. The court's obsession with religious ritual permeated the arts as painters and writers sought to make sense of a monarchy that seemed cursed. Charles himself, though limited in his understanding, found solace in simple pleasures, watching court entertainments, listening to music, or spending time with his pets, but his participation was always constrained by his physical and mental condition. The Spanish people, largely unaware of the full extent of their king's disabilities, began to sense the fragility of the monarchy. Official proclamations and public ceremonies were carefully managed to maintain the fiction of royal competence, but rumors of the cursed king spread through the streets of Madrid and beyond. Folk tales emerged, blending superstition with fear, suggesting that Charles was a changeling or the victim of witchcraft. These stories, while fanciful, reflected a growing unease about the state of the empire and the monarchy's ability to lead. The contrast between Spain's glorious past and its troubled present was stark, and the figure of Charles II, hidden behind the court's carefully constructed facade, became a symbol of that decline. The adolescence of Charles II was a period of denial and desperation for the Spanish court, as the reality of his unfitness to rule became impossible to ignore. The Habsburgs' genetic experiment, once a source of pride, had produced a king whose every breath testified to its failure. The court's efforts to conceal his condition were a testament to their loyalty to the dynasty, but they could not halt the empire's slide toward chaos. As Charles grew older, the question of his marriage and the succession loomed larger, setting the stage for further tragedy and the eventual collapse of the Spanish Habsburg line. By the late 1670s, the Spanish court faced an existential crisis. Charles II, the frail and incapacitated heir to the Habsburg throne, was approaching an age where marriage was essential to secure the dynasty's future. Born in 1665, Charles was the product of centuries of inbreeding, his body and mind ravaged by genetic disorders that made him an unlikely candidate for marriage or fatherhood. Yet the Spanish Empire, teetering on the edge of collapse, desperately needed an heir to maintain the Habsburg line and prevent a catastrophic succession crisis. The court's decision to arrange a marriage for Charles II was a desperate gamble, one that would expose the full extent of his limitations and deepen the political instability threatening Spain. His first marriage, to Marie-Louise of Orléans in 1679, was a tragic chapter in the Habsburg saga, marked by personal suffering and geopolitical maneuvering. Charles II was only 14 years old when the Spanish court began negotiations for his marriage, a process fraught with deception and difficulty. His physical and mental condition, marked by severe mandibular prognathism, epilepsy, mental retardation, and chronic frailty, made him an unappealing prospect for any royal family. His lower jaw protruded so far that he could not chew, relying on broths and porridges that he struggled to swallow. His speech was barely intelligible, his motor skills limited, and frequent seizures left him incapacitated for hours. Despite these challenges, the court knew that a royal marriage was essential to produce an heir and strengthen Spain's alliances in a Europe increasingly focused on the question of the Spanish succession. The Habsburgs' genetic decline was no longer a secret, and foreign courts whispered of the mad king whose very existence threatened the stability of the empire. The choice of Marie-Louise of Orléans, a 17-year-old French princess and niece of Louis XIV, was driven by political necessity rather than hope for a successful union. The marriage was intended to strengthen ties between Spain and France, which had been adversaries in recent wars, including the War of Devolution and the Franco-Dutch War. Louis XIV, eager to position France favorably in the impending succession crisis, saw the marriage as a way to secure influence over Spain. Marie-Louise, described as vibrant, intelligent, and beautiful, was everything Charles II was not. Her arrival in Spain in 1679 was a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of the Spanish court. Contemporary accounts describe a young woman full of life, accustomed to the lively French court, who was unprepared for the grim reality of her new role as queen to a king who could barely function. The wedding ceremony was a grim spectacle, reflecting the tragedy of the union. Charles, barely able to stand without assistance, seemed only dimly aware of the proceedings. His attendants propped him up, guiding his movements to maintain the illusion of regal dignity. Marie-Louise, by contrast, appeared visibly distressed, her fear and discomfort evident to those in attendance. The court's efforts to present Charles as a capable monarch were strained, with courtiers filling the silence with elaborate speeches and religious blessings to distract from his obvious frailties. The consummation of the marriage, a critical expectation for producing an heir, was delayed for months due to Charles's physical and mental limitations. His inability to understand or engage in marital relations was a source of profound embarrassment for the court, which went to great lengths to keep this fact hidden from foreign observers. Marie-Louise's letters to her family in France provide heartbreaking insight into her life as Charles II's wife. She described him as more dead than alive, unable to hold coherent conversations or participate in court activities. His constant drooling, seizures, and unintelligible speech horrified her, and she struggled to reconcile her role as queen with the reality of her husband's condition. The psychological toll of the marriage was immense. Marie-Louise, isolated in a foreign court, found herself surrounded by intrigue and suspicion, as Spanish nobles and French diplomats maneuvered for influence over the childless couple. Her vibrant personality dimmed under the weight of her circumstances, and her health began to deteriorate, marked by bouts of melancholy and physical exhaustion. The Spanish court's efforts to conceal Charles II's condition intensified during his marriage. Official portraits depicted him as a regal figure, his deformities softened by artistic license. Public appearances were limited to brief, carefully staged events, with attendants ensuring he remained upright and silent. The court's religious fervor, amplified by the Spanish Inquisition, played a central role in maintaining this facade. Priests offered constant prayers for the king's health and the success of the marriage, framing Charles's ailments as a divine test rather than a genetic catastrophe. Yet these efforts could not fully suppress the truth. Foreign ambassadors, particularly those from France, reported back on the king's bizarre behavior and obvious incapacity, fueling speculation about Spain's future. The failure of the marriage to produce an heir was a devastating blow to the Spanish court. Marie-Louise's letters reveal her growing certainty that Charles was incapable of fathering children, a reality that became apparent as months turned into years without a pregnancy. The court, desperate to maintain hope, spread rumors of impending heirs, but these were quickly dispelled by the lack of evidence. The Spanish Empire, already weakened by economic decline, military defeats, and internal corruption, faced mounting pressure as the prospect of a childless king loomed. The question of the Spanish succession became a central concern in European diplomacy, with France, Austria, and other powers positioning themselves to claim the throne upon Charles's death. Marie-Louise's health continued to decline under the strain of her impossible situation. By 1689, at the age of 26, she died suddenly, leaving no heirs and deepening the crisis surrounding the Habsburg dynasty. Contemporary rumors suggested poison, a reflection of the political tensions surrounding the succession, but modern historians attribute her death to the psychological and physical toll of her marriage. Her passing was a tragedy not only for her, but also for the Spanish court, which had pinned its hopes on her ability to produce an heir despite Charles's limitations. The failure of the marriage underscored the futility of the Habsburgs' genetic experiment, as the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity had produced a king incapable of continuing the line. The Spanish court's response to Marie-Louise's death was a mix of grief and desperation. Charles II, though limited in his understanding, was reportedly affected by her loss, showing signs of distress that added to his already fragile mental state. His paranoia grew more pronounced as he became convinced that her death was the result of a plot against him. The court, meanwhile, faced the daunting task of finding another bride for a king whose condition was deteriorating. The failure of the first marriage intensified the pressure on Charles to produce an heir, but it also made clear that such an outcome was increasingly unlikely. The Spanish Empire, already a shadow of its former glory, stood on the brink of a succession crisis that would reshape Europe. The marriage of Charles II and Marie-Louise was a microcosm of the Habsburgs' decline, a union doomed by the king's genetic afflictions and the court's inability to confront the truth. The Spanish monarchy, once the most powerful in Europe, was now represented by a king whose very existence testified to the dangers of inbreeding. As Charles entered his 20s, the court's efforts to maintain the illusion of royal competence grew ever more strained, while foreign powers circled, anticipating the collapse of the Habsburg line. The stage was set for Charles's second marriage and the final tragic years of his reign, as the dynasty's genetic gamble reached its inevitable conclusion. As Charles II entered his 20s in the 1680s, the Spanish court faced an undeniable reality. The Habsburg dynasty was on the brink of extinction, its legacy embodied by a king whose body and mind were ravaged by the genetic consequences of inbreeding. Born in 1665 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, Charles II was a living testament to the dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity, his severe deformities and disabilities a stark warning of the perils of their marriage practices. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orléans had ended in tragedy, producing no heirs and leaving the Spanish Empire in a deepening succession crisis. The court's desperate efforts to secure the Habsburg line led to a second marriage, but Charles's deteriorating condition, Spain's decline, and the looming specter of war would bring the dynasty to its tragic end. In 1690, at the age of 24, Charles II married Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen to strengthen ties with the Austrian Habsburgs and bolster Spain's position against French ambitions. Like his first marriage, this union was driven by political necessity, but it was equally doomed. Maria Anna, described as intelligent and ambitious, was unprepared for the reality of her husband's condition. Charles's physical frailties had worsened with age, his mandibular prognathism made eating and speaking nearly impossible, and his emaciated frame barely sustained him. Frequent seizures, a hallmark of his epilepsy, left him unconscious for hours, and his mental state had deteriorated into paranoia and confusion. Maria Anna's letters to her family reveal a woman horrified by her husband's bizarre behavior, his obsession with mirrors, his violent outbursts, and his insistence on elaborate rituals to ward off imagined threats. The marriage, like the first, produced no heirs, as Charles's genetic disorders rendered him incapable of fathering children. The Spanish court's efforts to conceal Charles II's condition grew increasingly futile. Official portraits continued to soften his deformities, depicting him as a regal figure draped in opulent robes, but the truth was impossible to hide. Public appearances were rare and tightly controlled, with attendants propping him up and courtiers filling the silence with flattery. The Spanish Inquisition, a powerful force in the deeply religious court, promoted the narrative that Charles's ailments were a divine test, leading to endless masses and prayers for his health. Yet, foreign ambassadors reported back to their governments with stark descriptions of a king who drooled uncontrollably, spoke in unintelligible fragments, and suffered seizures during state functions. The term "Mad King" became a whispered epithet across Europe, as the reality of Charles's incapacity fueled speculation about Spain's future. Charles II's psychological torment deepened in his final years. Trapped in a failing body and acutely aware of his role as the last Habsburg, he became consumed by paranoia, convinced that poisoners and assassins lurked in every shadow. His diet, limited to broths and porridges due to his inability to chew, was subject to elaborate food-tasting rituals, as he refused to eat anything not tested by trusted servants. His mental state oscillated between apathy and agitation, with hours spent praying before religious relics or staring at his reflection in mirrors, fascinated by his own distorted features. His relationship with Maria Anna deteriorated as she withdrew from court life, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of their situation. The queen, like Marie-Louise before her, became a tragic figure, isolated in a court that revolved around a king who could barely function. The Spanish Empire's decline accelerated during Charles II's reign. The treasury, drained by decades of war and mismanagement, was bankrupt. Colonial revenues, once the lifeblood of the empire, dwindled as trade routes shifted to rival powers like England and the Dutch Republic. The Spanish military, once a formidable force, suffered repeated defeats, its morale sapped by poor leadership and lack of resources. Corruption flourished as provincial governors and nobles exploited the absence of strong central authority. The Spanish Inquisition gained unprecedented influence, capitalizing on the court's religious fervor to assert control over a society grappling with economic hardship and political uncertainty. The arts and literature of the period reflected this decay, with paintings and writings steeped in themes of madness, divine judgment, and decline, often alluding to the royal family's plight. The question of the Spanish succession dominated European politics in the 1690s. Charles II's inability to produce an heir made it clear that the Spanish Habsburg line would end with his death, triggering a power struggle among Europe's major powers. France, under Louis XIV, claimed the throne through Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister, while the Austrian Habsburgs argued for reversion to their branch. England and the Dutch Republic formed alliances to counterbalance French or Austrian dominance, creating a web of treaties and military preparations. Diplomats in Madrid maintained a constant vigil, reporting on every seizure or illness as a potential harbinger of war. The Spanish court, aware of the stakes, functioned in a state of perpetual crisis, with ministers and advisors governing around Charles rather than through him. Important decisions were made by councils, with the king's role reduced to ceremonial appearances and symbolic authority. Charles II's final years were a descent into physical and mental ruin. By his late 30s, he appeared decades older, his hair thin and white, his skin sallow, and his body so frail he could barely walk. Seizures became more frequent and severe, sometimes occurring multiple times a day, leaving him unconscious for hours. His speech, never clear, became entirely unintelligible, reduced to gestures and facial expressions. His paranoia reached extreme levels, with elaborate fantasies about enemies plotting to steal his throne. He spent hours in prayer, prostrating himself before religious relics, convinced that divine intervention might cure his ailments. His chambers, filled with religious artifacts, became a shrine to his desperation, as priests and advisors offered constant spiritual counseling. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died at the age of 34, his body finally succumbing to the genetic disorders that had plagued him since birth. His death was both a relief and a catastrophe for the Spanish court. The autopsy, conducted by physicians unaware of the genetic basis for his condition, described a body ravaged beyond recognition, his organs putrefied, his brain smaller than normal, and his reproductive organs so underdeveloped that fatherhood was impossible. His death marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, a dynasty that had once ruled half the world but had bred itself into extinction. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted shortly after, as France, Austria, and their allies vied for control of Spain's territories. The conflict, lasting from 1701 to 1714, cost hundreds of thousands of lives and reshaped the balance of power in Europe, with the Bourbon dynasty ultimately claiming the Spanish throne. Charles II's story became a cautionary tale, echoing through the centuries as a warning of the dangers of genetic isolation. Other European royal families, observing the Habsburg disaster, began to reconsider their own marriage practices, gradually moving away from the extreme inbreeding that had characterized European nobility. The medical understanding of the time could not explain Charles's condition, but the connection between familial intermarriage and health problems became impossible to ignore. Court physicians quietly advised against close kin unions, laying the groundwork for more diverse marriage patterns in later generations. The legacy of the Habsburgs' genetic experiment was profound. A dynasty that had amassed unprecedented power through strategic marriages had destroyed itself by prioritizing bloodline purity over human health. The Alcazar of Madrid, where Charles II was born in 1665, fell silent with his death, the screams of childbirth replaced by the stillness of a dynasty's end. The Habsburg lip, once a mark of royal distinction, disappeared from European courts, but the lesson remained. Some victories come at a price too terrible to pay. Charles II, the broken man who embodied the consequences of his ancestors' choices, left behind a story of hubris and tragedy, a reminder that even the mightiest empires can fall when they tamper with the laws of nature.